So let's look at a practice SAQ for American Pageant, Chapter 17, and this covers the years 1840 to 1848. And this time period and this chapter mostly cover manifest destiny. So this SAQ says, in the mid-19th century, the idea of manifest destiny grew to prominence in America and brought conflict and prosperity. And then it asks, briefly describe one reason Americans justified manifest destiny. Briefly explain one domestic consequence caused by manifest destiny. And briefly describe one foreign consequence caused by manifest destiny. And so you can go ahead and pause the video and try to answer this question. Okay, so here we can look at what ChatGPT had to say. So this is kind of the, I guess you could say, like, optimal answer, the best answer, computer generated answer. So for A, briefly describe one reason Americans justified manifest destiny. The computer answered, Americans justified manifest destiny with the belief that they were divinely ordained to expand across the continent. So that's important. That's one thing that you could have mentioned, is divinely ordained. I think it's somewhere here. Okay, yeah. So divine is important because the Americans believed, like mostly white Americans were the people justifying it. They believed that it was their duty given to them by God, right? Divinely ordained. It was their duty given to them by God to expand democracy, right? Because they believed that democracy was ultimately like the best system and the least oppressive system, and they thought that by expanding, they were spreading democracy and fulfilling God's will for them to do so, to expand democracy. And this idea was, another thing that's important to mention is this idea was built on American cultural and racial superiority. Like I said, it was mostly perpetrated by white men and white people. So it's important to mention the idea of perceived racial superiority and moral duty and natural right. That kind of just ties back to the God part of it. So for B, briefly explain one domestic consequence caused by manifest destiny. So it's important to note that consequence doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. It could be a good thing or a bad thing, so you could have written about a good or a bad thing. But the computer said, manifest destiny led to significant internal conflict over the expansion of slavery. So the expansion of slavery was the biggest and most notable consequence of manifest destiny. It kind of created a division between the North and South, because whenever states in the South, for example with the annexation of Texas, whenever states in the South tried to expand and annex new territory and gain new territory, this North saw it as an attempt to expand the institution of slavery. So it created a national divide. You could have mentioned that if you talked about slavery. And it also says, as new territories were added, debates erupted between pro and anti-slavery factions. Okay, so that's what I just mentioned. And then this tension contributed to the sectional divide that ultimately led to the Civil War. That's another important thing to mention, is this expansion of territory led to the question of, should we expand slavery with the territory? And obviously the North said no and the South said yes, so that created a tension and divided the nation into two pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. Okay, so that's domestic consequence. And then C, briefly describe one foreign consequence caused by manifest destiny. So it says, one major foreign consequence of manifest destiny was the Mexican-American War. So for this one, the Mexican-American War is probably the easiest one to write about, probably the best choice. But you could have also talked about the Oregon dispute with Great Britain and the Treaty of 1818, that was kind of a stepping stone towards good relations with Great Britain. But you could have talked about that, or I would say the better one to talk about would be the Mexican-American War, which is what ChatGPT chose. So it says, one major foreign consequence of manifest destiny was the Mexican-American War. As the United States expanded into Texas and desired more southwestern lands, conflict with Mexico grew. Right here, you could kind of briefly mention. You could briefly mention when the U.S. was kind of sitting on the Texas and Mexican border, and Mexican troops attacked American troops, and that was clearly like them sitting. The American troops sitting on the border was obviously clearly a provocative measure to try to kind of start war because they wanted Texas. And so conflict with Mexico grew. You could have mentioned that. And then the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which forced Mexico to cede a large portion of its northern territory to the U.S., fulfilling much of the territorial expansion envisioned by Manifest Destiny. So I would say that's very important because it kind of it ties it back twice, because the war was caused by Manifest Destiny because we were going into Mexico, the U.S., was going into Mexico to try to kind of annex Texas, like to try to cause conflict to get Texas, or to just try to get Texas in general. So this first half is talking about how the Mexican-American War was caused by Manifest Destiny, and the second half, talking about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the war, talks about how that further contributed back into Manifest Destiny and continued the U.S.'s westward expansion. So thank you for watching. I hope this helps.